Pizza, are you timing?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll wait until pizza's ready.
I'm ready.
You ready?
Yeah.
Okay, so I didn't prepare to talk very much, so sorry it's a bit of a mess, but my talk is about does stuff change? So like disclaimer to start with, I'm not a philosopher by training or a physicist. This is just sort of like random stuff that I found interesting and I hope you do too. Next slide. So initially I was thinking about this because I was watching a video by this guy Rich Hickey, who's the inventor of a language called Clojure, a programming language, and he was talking about databases and immutable data structures. And he was talking about it in terms of rather than changing the database of a business, what would it be like if we were discovering it instead? So as time passes, the data reveals itself. And the image that he used is like if you've ever played a video game, StarCraft or something like that, and you explore the map, like the fog of war goes away and you reveal it as time passes. And so I thought, oh, that's quite a cool idea about how to think about databases and businesses, but maybe also like everything, right? Like maybe everything's like that. And this is kind of how a guy called Parmenides thought. Parmenides is an interesting philosopher, ancient Greek philosopher, and arguably the first ever philosopher, so incredibly influential. But because he was right on the cusp of philosophy and like, I don't know, the religions that preceded that, the pagan religions, he had some ideas that are quite foreign to us now. One is that there is no such thing as time, and everything in the universe is one unseparatable, unified, timeless block, right? So it's like, that's quite a weird way to think about the universe. There's no past, there's no future, and change is impossible. So, interesting, but quite strange. Like, he was a teacher of a guy that you may more likely have heard of, probably, called Zeno. So Zeno's famous for his paradoxes, and his paradoxes are usually in the form of what are called supertasks. So it's about like dividing something in infinite times, or like, do you ever approach a thing because you can keep on subdividing the distance between you and that thing, right? How do you solve this problem? So this class of problems are supertasks, and these parables make more sense if you think about it in terms of his teacher, because what he was really teaching is the idea of Parmenides, that there is no time. Time doesn't pass. It is impossible to have things like motion. It's impossible to have things like progress. There's only infinity. And I can talk more about that, like Thompson's lamp, but I'm going to go on to the next slide because I'm running out of time. So, okay, we've looked at one side of this discussion. Nothing changes at all. What's the other team? The other team is headed up by Heraclitus, who was just a little bit after Parmenides and represents the exact polar opposite in thinking, which is that, in fact, not only do things change, but there is nothing but change. So the universe is made of flux, is what he calls it. And flux is, the primal substance of the universe is change in of itself. And actually, we can understand things more deeply by understanding how change works. So even if you haven't heard of Heraclitus, you might have heard of some things that he talked about. For example, you can't step in the same river twice, or a ship of Theseus, this idea that like, if you have a ship and you change the mast, and you change the sails, and you change the body, I don't know what these ships are called, then is it the same ship or is it a new ship, right? The idea is like, can we change things, or is there any object continuity, right? Or does the object change from one moment to the next? If I throw an arrow, if I shoot an arrow into a wall, is the arrow that hits the wall the same one that I fire? So we've got two teams there, but what does this mean? Like, what is time? How does time exist in this idea? Either time's everything or nothing. I feel like that's quite absolute. We want to like know what it is, really. What is time? So in physics, some people have talked about time as being similar or the same as entropy. So Boltzmann is, I guess, somewhere between a philosopher and a physicist, and he talks about that idea. So what is entropy? It's like a measure of disorder. As things become more disordered, time passes. And there's only one direction that entropy works. That's a fundamental law of physics, and that's why time only moves in one direction. But this kind of made me think about some questions like, why was entropy ever low to start with? Why did it start low and get high? And also, is it subjective? Like, what's ordered to me might not necessarily be ordered to you. Like, a deck of cards, for example, if they're sorted in rank order, is that a more sorted deck of cards than a shuffled one? Only if I know, if I have a belief of what a sorted deck of cards is, then it's sorted. But that's only a statement about what I think a sorted deck of cards is, rather than it being inherently more ordered or less ordered. So, anyway, bunch of thoughts there, no real conclusion, but I hope it was interesting to you. And, the takeaways I think are, the two extremes, flux and stasis. I think that's a nice way to think about things and can be useful when we're designing systems, for example. Processes over objects, especially. So it's like, sometimes we want to think in terms of nouns, but it's useful for understanding to maybe flip that round from time to time and think about things in terms of verbs instead. And maybe time is an illusion. And here's a quote by Carlo Rovelli, who wrote a book called The Order of Time, which I strongly recommend. He's a physicist, but he writes in a very approachable way. And he says, is it really possible that perception is so vivid, basic, existential? My perception of the passage of time depends on the fact that I cannot comprehend the world in all of its minute detail. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Can you repeat that?
That's a valid question. So I have a question. So you talk about time and flux and being static or flux.
Yeah.
Tell me, do you think, like, considering that it's static, right?
Right.
Do you believe there's a way to split it, like, to the minimal parts of unit? So just like matter, you split it into atoms, right?
Yeah.
So that's the minimal. You cannot split it further because it will just lose its characteristics. Can you also split time like that? To, like, what would be the
Right. Well,
smallest?
I'm not a physicist. I imagine that like Planck lengths get involved here, but I don't really know about that. So if someone more educated than me wants to chime in with an answer, that's fine. But in terms of continually subdividing things, like this is the interest of Zeno as a philosopher, right? And this is his main topic, which is like, can we indefinitely divide things? And what does that mean? So one of his famous parables is called Achilles and the tortoise, right? So it's like, Achilles, a guy, a hero, very fast, he can run fast. Tortoise, slow, obviously. And the idea is like, well, the tortoise, they've got a race, so it's one unit, let's say, and the tortoise is halfway advanced, it starts there, and Achilles starts at the start line. Who gets to the finish line first? Well, as soon as Achilles has reached the position of the tortoise is advanced like 1 over n amount, right? And then as soon as he gets to the tortoise again, the tortoise is advanced more. So how can Achilles ever take over the tortoise, right? And the sort of, I think I realise this is a very long answer to your question.
That's okay.
Maybe like the high school maths answer is like, well, it's limits, stupid, right? This is like, we can talk about infinity in terms of limits, and you approach the limit, and it's like, well, but it's like, there's something unsatisfying in my mind about that answer. And so a philosopher called Thomson he was a more modern philosopher, has also talked about super tasks. So that's this idea of like a task that has an infinite number of subtasks in it. Like how do you finish the super task, right? And his one is about a lamp that switches on and off faster and faster and faster until it reaches an infinite speed, and then you stop it. Is it on or is it off? Right? This is the problem. So it's like there's no limit answer to that question, right? Because the limit isn't real. There's no such thing really as the infinite subdivision phase. No. So this is why, like, I think that the way that people deal with Zeno is being like, oh, here's this really like quite abstract mathematical idea that doesn't really like it's useful for understanding reality, but it doesn't tell you why really that you can ever overtake that point, which I think is why people are still interested and talk about Zeno compared to like Parmenides, who I don't think is so known as a philosopher, and like Heraclitus, maybe in between two. People like the ship of Theseus. I feel like that's kind of like often referred to as an idea.
Question is, how did you come across this? What was the thing that inspired this question for you? And also, is it purely a philosophical question, or how has it influenced any of your decisions in life?
Oh, okay, good question. So the inspiration was listening to Rich Hickey talk about, his talk is, if you want to look it up, it's called The Databases of Value, and it's about the design of a database that his company builds. His company's called Cognitech, and the database is called Datomic, and it is a great piece of software. So he's very interested in immutability in software, which I guess is a more popular topic now than maybe in the past when resources on a machine were more scarce and therefore it didn't make sense to keep on filling up disk space and stuff like this. The idea of immutability in limited. Okay, I don't want to say this, but anyway, so that was kind of the inspiration, and in terms of the takeaways, like I think it's this idea that you rather than the value changing, you're revealing more information as time passes. So like, say you are a business and you are onboarding customers, right? It's like, you're actually like revealing the customers that were supposed to be part of your business in a sense. And it's like, I'm not saying that's true, I'm just saying it's a different way of thinking about things and it might affect how the decisions that you make. Right? Oh, that's the end, technically, yeah, sorry.